Right, hi, everybody. We are here with Cathy Moore herself. Hey,
Hey
Cathy.
everyone.
Hi, everybody. We're both very excited to be here live. I know you are all are as well. Today's session will be a little bit different. We're going to do a brief intro to action mapping, but I'm sure most of us here are very familiar with it and comfortable with it. Um, and if you're not, and if you're new to it, that's okay too. But this session, we're going to get into Cathy Moore's personal history with action mapping, how she even found a need for this in the first place, and then the struggles that she faced along the way implementing this process. So we're going to get into it all. We also will be able to answer your questions to help you implement action mapping more easily. This is the action mapping Bible, maybe we can call it. This is Map It. This is Cathy Moore's book where she lays out this whole process. Um, so we may be mentioning that as well. So hey everybody. Hey Kathy. Maybe to
Hey,
start
thank you
things
for having
off,
me.
yeah, we're all very happy that you're here. And maybe to start things off again, I think most of us are familiar with action mapping, but if you can just give us all a reminder of what even is action mapping.
Action mapping is an approach to training design. I don't call it an approach to instructional design, but to training design because I define our goal as changing what people do, not what they know. And it sort of flips the conventional process upside down, where we start with what is it that we need people to do? Well, actually, we start with what is the business goal? How will the business benefit when this project is done? How do we even justify the cost of the project? And then what is it that we need people to do to reach this goal? Why aren't they doing it? Will training actually help? What sort of practice activities will help them develop the skills or whatever that they need? Is training part of the solution for that? Then that involves practice, not information dumps. And then finally, we consider what information do they need to know? And that's delivered only as sort of a support to changing or supporting their behavior. Whereas a traditional approach starts with what do they need to know? Let's dump it on them. That's
Okay.
an info dump.
Yeah. So traditional approach, start yeah. What information do they need to know? But with action mapping, that comes at the very, very, very end. It's like, what's
Yeah.
the business goal? What do people need to do? How do we help them practice? Do we even need training to help with this? And then at the very, very end, it's like, what absolutely essential information do we need these people to have to do the job or to do these tasks? So flips the script a bit on the traditional approach. And yeah, that's what we call info dumps or information dumps, right? Just what do we need people to know? Let's dump a lot of information on them and just hope that it helps them do something differently.
It's a little bit like backwards design, which people coming out of academia might be familiar with, where you start with the test and then you work backwards from that. What do they need to know specifically for this test, basically? But it's in the world of work, of actual behavior on the job, rather than what can they regurgitate out of their brains.
Nice. So yeah, that's going to set the context for this whole session. If ever anyone is new to this, if you do have any questions as we go, use that Q&A tab. But I do have some questions prepared just for us to learn a bit more about Kathy's history with this. A lot of this will be new to me too, so I'll be learning with you all. But use that Q&A tab if you have any specific questions. Okay, so we discussed the info dumps. Did you work on projects like this?
Yes. I have a long, long, shameful past of cranking out information dumps.
The
And
shameful past, yeah.
it's very, yeah,
We all can relate.
I'm sure. Um, the do you need the origin story or
Yeah, yeah, let's hear about it, yeah. What was your experience like creating these, and how did we get to action mapping?
um, I'm old. I was working to put myself through school when microcomputers came out, and my job was to help librarians who were on the cutting edge of technology and still are in a lot of ways, help them learn to use these microcomputer things. Um, it involved IBM PC, the Apple II, whatever, and then the Macintosh. So all of these things were new. We had floppy disks, the whole thing. And my job was to kind of quickly get a bunch of librarians up to speed as these things were plunked on their desks and they had no clue what to do with them. And so my job was entirely help people do stuff with these tools. And everything that I did was just sort of seat of the pants, through lots of trial and error, what kind of instruction, what kind of technical support, what kind of printed materials help them get up to speed quickly and also get over their emotional resistance, some of them, to these computers, because this was at a time when a lot of people became librarians because they loved books. And then suddenly all the books are cleared off of their desk. Their boss puts down this huge, ugly IBM PC and says, this is what you're doing now. So we also had to work with motivation a lot. And so it was a really, really great way to learn how to do training.
Yeah.
And then after that, finally, I got a little bit burned out of having to do tech support for a million different computers. I went into distance education. So I worked for a university editing literal correspondence courses. These are printed booklets. And even though email existed at the time, the professors were not comfortable using it. And so people, if you took a course, you got a paper booklet, you wrote your assignments on paper and you sent them through the mail to the professor who 2 weeks later might respond. That was what it was like. And that seemed a little low tech to me. So I ended up working in K-12 when e-learning was new and they were still trying to figure out, what do we call this? Do we call this e-learning and how do we spell it? And that was more of the academia. So the correspondence courses were very traditional university courses. It was a lecture as a book and then an exam. And then in the K-12 e-learning, it was the same thing. It was way more fun because it involved cartoons and fun stories and everything, but it was still, again, we had a list of state mandated objectives. I'm sure everybody in education here knows what I'm talking about. We had to meet those, and those were measured by a test. So we were basically teaching to a test, but doing it in a sort of, fun way with cartoons. And from there, I got into corporate e-learning, but I got in with small companies that were offshoots of a university. So they still had the university mindset. And it was lectures on the screen, some multiple choice questions to test your knowledge, more applied than a university lecture, but still very much information dumps. And I did that for years until my frustration reached such a high level that I thought I have to find a different way to do this. And so I started thinking in terms of action mapping, and then I quit working for other people and worked for myself so I could call the shots.
Okay, nice.
So
So
that was
yeah,
years
you're
and years of information dumps.
yeah. But your origin story, like, yeah, it kind of follows like the progression of like e-learning as a whole. Like you were working in, yeah, I mean, you were helping people use computers for the first time, it sounds like. Distance education, I remember that was my first exposure to like, I mean, not like e-learning, but yeah, my first exposure to distance education. It was in like the South Pacific. I was talking to professors there, and they're like, "Yeah, this is how we like do learning. There's this university, and then they send out the materials to all these different island nations, and then the students there send stuff back." And I was like, "Wow, yeah, very interesting," because they don't have internet access in some of those
Yeah,
places. So that still happens today in some places, but yeah, interesting that that was just like the norm for distance education in the past.
it was
Um,
very much. Yeah.
yeah. But okay, so you're working on Infodumps for years before you went out on your own, and frustration reached an all-time high. Can you
Yeah.
talk a bit about that frustration? I know I can relate to that, and I know what I can imagine what you were feeling, but can you tell us about that frustration?
The the companies that I worked with, I was always, in typical American fashion, I was always a contractor, not an employee. So I worked with multiple companies, and they all had the traditional approach where we start out with the learning objectives and we carefully write the learning objectives. Um, and then we structure our lessons according to these learning objectives. So we could have this like matrix saying this lesson covers this learning objective. And that is also what the clients wanted. You have this loop where if you position yourself as being, for example, some of the companies I worked with, we have strong academic roots. We only hire PhDs, except for me. We we have this academic approach, and so then they attract the kinds of clients that want the traditional familiar list of learning objectives and presentation, knowledge check, lesson 2, presentation, knowledge check. Um, I became frustrated with that because I was also working as a marketing person. And I noticed that in marketing, we measure our success in a million different ways. Like with online marketing, you're measuring how sticky is your website? How long do people stay on the site? There's a million little things you can measure to see if people are actually changing their behavior according to the way you want them to change it. And that stark contrast between my marketing world and my instructional design world really bugged me because I also knew how many thousands, tens of thousands of dollars clients were paying for these courses with absolutely no measurement of whether they did anything. Whereas in marketing, man, we couldn't spend $500 without proving,
Yeah.
look, it worked. So that's when I started thinking, there has to be a way to change. And I don't think I want to work for another company. I want to come up with a way to make it happen and then get clients that agree with me.
Nice.
So
Okay. So you're like, so I imagine, I mean, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but trying to like bring your current clients like on board with that approach. I know when you're a contractor or like a
yeah,
subcontractor, you don't have a lot of like agency over that like client
yeah,
relationship. Like you're just, yeah, I mean, you very much are like an order taker. And I've been in that situation myself. Yeah, it's
yeah.
frustrating. I'm like, I want to land direct clients and then I can use action mapping basically. But then I would still get frustrated when it seems like people I would talk to are still like so far from that approach sometimes. Um,
That's been the big challenge. And I had a non-compete too with my major client. And so I certainly couldn't take any of the ones from them that I'd already worked with. So I had to completely create my own client list, which I did with a blog. And this was in 2007 when launching a blog could still like have an effect. I think it would be harder now to just start with a blog. Um, but and then I started all of that while I was still working with e-learning companies, but I also started going to conferences and presenting my ideas and refining my ideas. And the first version of action mapping was a more simplistic one where you identify a measurable business goal, I at least had that, identify what people need to do, design practice activities, and identify the information. And people familiar with action mapping will see that I skipped an extremely important step. And that is when you identify what people need to do not assume that training will make them do it. You have to ask, why aren't they doing it? And identify if training really is some part of the solution. So that's something I added like 2 years later. And then when I added it, I had to like really promote it because it adds a huge amount of friction and a huge amount of weirdness because people who go into instructional design, especially if you go through a conventional ID school, you might not learn about how to stand up to assumptions and ask the challenging questions that reveal problems in the organization.
Yeah, and if any, and I'm sure a lot of us here can relate to that. Like, let us know in the chat if you can relate to all of this. I mean, I know I definitely can. Yeah, I went to a very traditional, like, respected program. You learn how to do a needs assessment and like figure out, yeah, when it's training the answer. I was so excited. I'm like, this seems so valuable. Of course, we need to do this. Yeah, you go out there and like very, very hard getting clients on board with that when they're like, oh yeah, we need a course, we need e-learning, yeah, we need a developer. So, it definitely felt like an uphill battle actually getting out there in the real world. No one talks about how, like, yeah, how you actually get stakeholders on board with this when, like, they just want, like, a deliverable. Um,
And a big
so
part of it, as I think I mentioned before, is how you market yourself.
yeah,
And that's a huge thing for people who are going out on their own or who are looking for a job that will not drive them into frustration, to make sure that you are attracting clients or employers that are on board with doing a real needs analysis, not a check the box thing, a real audience
yeah,
analysis, not our audience consists of people who are aged 20 something to something. No, 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 no. That's, you have to like
yeah,
ask the difficult questions.
yeah. And yeah, as we can see in the chat, yeah, I mean, this if you've been in this field for any duration of time, you can probably relate to some of these frustrations. And I know we didn't label it as such a little bit earlier, but when you talked about attracting like the academic kind of clients, like we need a course basically, like you call that in Map It the school model. And I love that
Yeah,
analogy. Like it makes so much sense. It's like, oh, we've all been to school, we've all experienced classes. That's what learning looks like. That's what learning should look like. It's what we're familiar with.
yeah.
Um, So
And it's the huge cultural difference. It's really stark in my past when I was working like on distance education at a university and in the K to 12 world. They were both 1000% into what is happening inside the person's head. That's all we care about. And that's where like things like Bloom's taxonomy and these other things come into play. And people, they're very exciting. You can categorize different types of thought and different types of knowledge. And in the meantime, Cathy Moore is over hitting her head against the wall because none of this necessarily expresses itself as doing something differently in the world.
yeah.
And that's not really the goal in education necessarily, to have people do specific things differently in the world. So it's hard to, I think there's a huge mindset shift that has to happen, as I'm sure you're familiar with, of people coming out of education, especially if you want to go into corporate e-learning, and especially if you want to do this sort of action mappy approach. You're going to be fighting your own programming. And worse, all of your clients are coming to you expecting a list of learning objectives, and they want people to understand or be aware. And you have to be able to fight that.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. It's not just your own beliefs around learning and expectations, but also when the clients are coming to you and they share
Yeah.
some of those, it's a tough kind of cultural problem there. Something that we're touching on here, and maybe we had this question for later, but I think it might be good to address now. And I don't know if you mentioned it and Map It, but yeah, like Bloom's taxonomy, when we're like writing the traditional learning objectives that are very like cognitive, basically, does that have a place in action mapping? Does action mapping replace that approach completely? Does that come later when we're thinking about what people like need to know to do the job? What is your take on that, or how do you view it?
Um, I have a bachelor's in English. That's it.
Same, nice.
Okay. The instructional design degree did not exist when I started training people. This was 1981, I believe. Um, so I learned things like Bloom's taxonomy and various common aspects of our field sort of through osmosis by being around other instructional designers, especially when I was working in places that were offshoots of universities. I frankly never saw a good use for it. Um, there's different ways to categorize things. Bloom's taxonomy, to me, is a very abstract way of looking at knowledge. And I'm not sure that the different levels, first they get misinterpreted too, because you think you're moving up the pyramid and all of that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that dissecting it to that level is that useful, because our focus should be, what is it that this person needs to do? What makes it difficult? And how can we help make it easier? And maybe that involves having them memorize some stuff so it's fluent, it comes easily. It also involves having them practice things. So the Bloom's taxonomy kind of abstract approach doesn't work for me, but I have to say I worked on an Army project for some time. And man, those people can analyze. We were working on a cross-cultural program, and cross-cultural skills are really messy. And if you say, we want our people to be able to relate well to X, Y, and Z, to take perspective, to change their perspective and see the world from another perspective, that is an incredibly complex skill. And then it does make sense to me to say, okay, what are the skills underlying this one?
Mm-hmm.
So like to be able to schmooze with somebody from a culture that is very schmoozy, we're very much, let's get this done, let's talk about what we need to do. And the person you're trying to relate to is, let's have some tea and talk about our children.
Yeah.
How do you manage your discomfort with that? How do you navigate this huge numbers of skills and metacognition, being aware of your own emotions, that goes way, that just blows, at least the way I've seen Bloom's taxonomy used is very simplistic compared to that sort of analysis. So I'm
Okay.
not saying analysis is bad. I'm not saying that like dissecting what's going on in somebody's head is bad, but I think it needs to have a focus on what they need to do. It needs to be very laser focused on that. And to get away from like categorizing types of knowledge and look more at types of cognitive skills, like metacognition, which I think we don't pay enough attention to.
Nice. Okay. Okay, okay. So it has a place when it comes to cognitive skills. I like that distinction. Yeah, when I think about action mapping, it's very like practical, like what can we see people doing, but
Yeah.
it does have a place for some cognitive skills as well, if that's what's necessary to, I guess, modify your action. Okay, cool. Very interesting. Thank you for that distinction. It's good getting your take on blooms. I know I asked that because I work with a lot of people on their action maps, and a lot of the times it will be like they're using blooms to like add pieces to the action map, and it's like
Oh, yeah.
want to keep these as actions, not these like cognitive kind of ones. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a very common, and again, it's because of the school model and our brainwashing or programming to for us to focus on, okay, they have to be able to define this, and they have to be able to,
yeah.
select this. They have to be able
Identify
to,
this. Yep.
yeah, identify that. Most people know to avoid, understand, and appreciate, but those will also sometimes show up on the map because they'll say, well, before they can um, like relate to this guy who wants to drink tea instead of talk about the problem, they have to understand the, yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
they do, but there's a
Yeah.
lot more going on.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well said. And yeah, keep the questions coming. I see we have some good questions that are asked. We have a few more over here, and then we'll dive into all of your questions as well for this second part of this. Um,
I just realized this the
okay, so
chat
maybe
was
let's
scrolling.
let's dive back over to the origin story. Let's finish
Okay.
this out. I think that we could probably take away some actionable insights from that. So you're like, I'm going out on my own. I think I'll have more influence. Yeah, I'm gonna blog. I'm gonna create content to show off my approach, and then the people who are on board with that, yeah, they'll read this content. If they're on board, we'll work together, and we'll actually be able to like make a difference here. So, did
That
it
wasn't
happen quite
bad.
so smoothly, or yeah, what was it like when you went out on your own? You started getting some of those clients. Um,
I did not get those clients very easily.
okay,
And here's business advice from the elderly. I cut my living expenses to the bone. I lived in a trailer. I bought an old trailer. It was $3,000. I parked
nice.
it in some woods that I had bought. I had bought some acreage. I fixed up a house, sold the house, and with that money, I bought some woods. And all I had left was a trailer. So I parked the trailer in the woods. I get the internet out there. But that meant that I was living for free, essentially. So that meant I did not have to write boring, horrible information dump courses. I could say no. When a
Yeah,
client said, we need you to make this, often I was hired to make a boring course more interesting. I was supposed to like take this, something that somebody else had made, and I was supposed to polish it up and make it funny and all of that. And I did that when I needed money, but if you're living in a trailer with your dog and firewood and a big garden, you can say no to the people that want you to do stuff that you don't want to do anymore. So that's my big business advice has always been cut your expenses down so that you are not desperate and you can say no from the very beginning to clients who are a bad fit. And then it took me a while to make very clear through my marketing and through my business structure that I am not writing courses for you based on the learning objectives you give me. And I did have to do that a while because it took me a while to attract the people who wanted a different approach. And the way I got the people with a different approach was to offer myself as a consultant. I will walk you through how to analyze this problem, and that also got me away from having to be in the guts of writing a course because I would get impatient. I'm not the most patient person. I would get impatient with the endless tweaks and edits and everything, as everybody here, I'm sure, is very familiar with. I only wrote scripts. I never had to actually develop e-learning. But even just at the script stage, it'll go through reviewers and then they'll say, oh, well, Lisa in compliance needs to see it. And then Lisa sees it and there's a million more changes that somebody else
yep.
disagrees with. You're all familiar with that. I kind of got out of that by saying, I will walk you through how to look at your performance problem, help you decide what kind of training, if any, is the solution. And if you want, I'll help you kind of figure out how you're going to approach this project, but I will not write it. And I will review stuff that you do if you want, but I will not get down in the weeds with that. And that helped. So
Yeah. I can I can see how that would help a lot. Okay, so cut your expenses to the minimum. You basically had no like rent to do or anything. But I mean, I'm sure obviously you
that's
still had
great.
expenses, but it's like cut it to a minimum. I'm gonna take on as few of these info dump projects as possible. It's just not good for me, not good for the client. I
Yeah.
want something different for my business, and like you were determined to make it happen.
A huge amount of determination, really, and a willingness to take on, literal discomfort. It was a great trailer, but still, there were mice and everything.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there's I think a lot of people, and I see this in people more recently than when I was young. I started working when I was 12, and so I come
Wow.
from this background of you work, and I know that now it's much more common for people to think that they need to get a degree in order to get a job. And in some respects, that is enforced. I can see employers requiring degrees that I think maybe not actually are really required. But I was lucky that I got into this when you did not require a degree. And I forget where I was going with that. Oh, I think that unfortunately, a lot of people these days are sort of um, encouraged to believe that your progress forward in your career is to get a degree, and then you'll get a job, and then you'll move up in that job. And my approach has always been you go after what you want with determination, and you set up your personal life and your finances in such a way that you can easily quit. And it's I a strong term I won't use, but you have a certain pile of money that is your freedom money,
Yeah.
so that when you
Yeah.
realize you're not going anywhere, you can quit. Because the only way I ever moved up in any organization was to quit
Yep.
and then get a different job at a different place. So that's my old hippie approach.
I mean, I think that approach is good, and yeah, if you didn't suffer that discomfort, I don't think we would have what we have today. Who knows? Maybe you'd still be pumping out info dumps to this day, which would be a very sad sight to behold, right?
I would be, oh.
Yeah, but obviously the entire industry is better off from you making that choice, and I'm sure. I mean, I can kind of relate to what you're saying. Like, I'm. It sounds like the way you viewed it, like it wasn't much of a choice. It like had to be this way. Like you're done with the info dumps. If you
Yeah.
have any say in the matter, you're like, I will make this work, and that's what brought us here. Um,
Yeah, you
very
get to a point where not only is it something that you don't necessarily enjoy doing, like it's boring or whatever, but you see that it is not having an effect.
yeah,
When I lived in the trailer, one of my clients was a major bank that spectacularly failed, and I worked on their compliance courses.
yeah,
So, that
yeah.
year I thought, forget this.
Uh,
Just-
and that's where I was at right before reading this. Like I was maybe a year into the field. I was working on these projects as a developer, so not like the writer, but the developer. And yeah, I was watching these companies spend like hundreds of grand on these projects with like these huge teams. And I'm like, this is not going to help someone do anything. This isn't helping the people. This isn't helping the business. Appreciate making the money, but like, what? This cannot be right. And that's when I read this, and it was like speaking to my soul. I'm like,
wow.
yes, like this is like I need to try this like yesterday. So that's where I was at when I read this, and it couldn't have come at a better time.
Wow.
And that's why I just from watching the chat and just I feel like so many people can relate to that frustration, not many of us are in the position or make that leap and say, I'm just done doing this. There is another way, and I'm going to figure it out.
Yeah.
But but so it was hard in the beginning. And your approach was creating content um, to try to attract that ideal client. I mean, do you remember the first client that was kind of on board with this approach, like, fully, and what that experience was like?
They, I was astonished. Really, it was really cool. They were a consulting client, and I think I have them in the book as an example. They called saying that they needed ethics training, and everyone here who's had any experience will know that if somebody says we need ethics training, there's probably a problem in the organization that has nothing to do with whether they know what's right and wrong. It's something else. They don't need to be told this is right and this is wrong. Um, so we had a phone conference. I was living in Mexico at the time, which is another aspect of being able to be free to choose your clients is to live geographic arbitrage to live in inexpensive places. So you have the freedom to accept or reject clients. And they said, we have an ethics problem. Employees of our stores are fudging their reports and everything. And they were open to hearing that maybe ethics training was not going to work. And so we talked and they realized I could hear the gears going and I could hear them going, whoa, wait. And it ended up being an entirely different project because they realized they had the wrong audience and the wrong problem. So that was really, really satisfying. It was super
Nice.
satisfying because I saved like 30,000 employees from another click through don't be a bad person course.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
instead they tried to solve the problem.
Right. Okay, good. So they were on board. They were receptive to maybe this isn't actually going to solve the problem. But
Yeah,
from your opening chapters of Map It and yeah, you go really deep into like how to have these tough conversations with stakeholders, especially when they are set on a course being the
yeah,
solution. It seems like you've had a lot of experience in navigating those conversations. So I guess since
yeah.
then, yeah, I mean, I imagine you've been in a handful of situations where they're not so receptive, but because of how you've learned to like approach the discussion, it seems like you're able to have decent success with that, or do you think some clients just like aren't going to get there?
Some clients are not going to get there.
Okay, so it's
And
accepting that. Okay.
yeah, and you do what you can.
Yep.
I have not worked directly with clients for several years now, but I learned about it, the ongoing challenge through, I used to have a live course on scenario design. And wow, it's like the first 2 weeks of that course, they were doing the analysis and meeting with their stakeholders, and they would report back to me how it was going or wasn't going. And
Right.
so that was taught me a huge amount because I was getting it not just from my own little narrow experience, but from all these different types of organizations, NGOs, corporate, government, everybody. They're all facing the same issue.
Yeah.
So that actually fed the book a lot too. A lot of the examples in the book came from people who, I was working with them, trying to help them have the conversation.
Nice. Okay, good. So not even just your own experience, but the experience of all these other IDs who are
Yeah.
trying to use this process. Which I guess brings us into another question. Yeah, when did the book come into play? Like after you at a certain point, it seems like yeah, you were leading classes and training for other IDs, and then you were like, I can put this all into a book and spread it
Yeah.
even wider.
Put it all in a book and have to do fewer live sessions. um,
Yeah.
I felt like it was extremely valuable to work as an ID in the trenches, creating information dumps, work with clients who are struggling to change their approach, and work with IDs who are struggling to change their approach. And after I had done that for like, I think it was 10 years,
Wow.
12
Okay.
years, I did that for 12 years. Um, I felt, okay, I think I've got a big enough picture of this now, and I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again. So let's put it in a book. I'll say it once, unfortunately, in 400 pages. Sorry, everybody, but I'll say it once, and then I don't have to keep repeating it necessarily. People can get the book and they can work through it at their own pace and adapt it into their organization. And now it's become sort of interactive toolkits as well for people who want to go deeper into it. I have these online toolkits. People call them courses, but they're really supposed to be sort of monster job aids that walk you through a project. So you work through a project with this toolkit thing. And there are organizations that are using those and they're having people go through them as a cohort because they want to view it as a course. But at least, it helps you apply this more specifically to a project on your job. But the book alone can do that too. That's how it's designed too.
Nice. So after over a decade of like working with all of these different sides of the same problem, like yeah, people are at different parts of this, like the client, the ID, all of them. The process was pretty ironed out. You're like, okay, this works. I'm repeating myself. Like we've got it figured out, but now it looks like you were looking to like scale it. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're like, okay, the live classes, that's fine, but we put it in a book. Yeah, it's just gonna keep doing the work for me, basically. Same thing with the toolkits. And the book
yeah,
we're talking about is Map It by Cathy Moore. You've probably seen this like on LinkedIn and everyone when they post their like ID book hauls. This is like the top book recommendation I give to people. And we're starting a book club for this book. So people ask me, like someone asked me last week, they're like, "Yeah, I've seen your content with Cathy Moore. Like I've been on the blog. Do I still need to read the book? Like, is that a good replacement for the book?" And I'm like, "No." Like there is no replacement for this book. And yeah, Cathy, we were talking before the session. She's like, I look back on it and I just feel like it's like too long. And some people are like, yeah, worried it's gonna read like a textbook, but it does not read like a textbook at all. Like it's not just like yeah, it's like fun to read. Like it's like funny. You're like humorous. Like I don't know how you pull it off. I mean, guess that
You get
English major background. I don't know. I don't know if I could pull that off, but yeah.
that's the thing is, again, it's like you make sure that your life is in a place where if somebody gets mad at you or gets offended, it doesn't hurt you. It doesn't
Yeah.
affect you. And then you're
Yeah.
free to say what you want,
Yeah.
although,
Reading
within
this is an
reason.
experience, yeah, unlike any other ID book I've read. So if I mean, I imagine a lot most of us here have read it, but if you haven't, this is definitely the next ID book I would recommend you buying, especially if you want to work through it with us in the book club. So we'll do an info session next week. I just wanted to get that in there before we forget, or in case we get too wrapped up into answering questions at the end. Um, okay, so you wrote the book. Um, yeah, how was it received? And you said something really interesting before the call too, which I think is so funny and will be good for people to hear about. But yeah, how is it received? What is your impression of the impact that the book has had? Maybe.
When I published it,
Yep.
I expected it to, like, new book, so it has sales. And then I thought it'll just slide down over the years into obscurity, and then I'll retire or something. and
Yeah.
and what it's done instead was it started out about here, and then it's been going up and up and up. So apparently, it is answering a need that people have, and people like you, thank you, are recommending it. So that's great. It's great to see it being applied. And I'm also happy, possibly concerned, to see that there are job announcements for IDs that are saying you need to know action mapping. And I know people are, they're teaching it at conferences and everything. I haven't trademarked it, so people take it and run with it. And so I think it has some sort of future. I don't know how long of a future. There's certainly been a lot of instructional design models that have come and gone.
Yeah.
So, but I do like, I'm happy to see that it got the reception it's gotten, and it has brought a lot of really cool people into my life, because people who like action mapping, well, they're my kind of people. And so then I get to have
Yeah.
the clients and the customers that I enjoy having. So it's a win-win.
Nice. So it's had a wider reach than you expected, or at least a more like a longer sustaining reach than you would have imagined.
Yeah,
Sounds like.
yeah,
I mean, yeah, you still published it fairly recently, right? You published this in 2019?
yeah. So I think if I may like give it a little dust up. I know some of the images in the print version of the book, they're not very good quality. The way that Amazon printing works is not so great. So I may give it a little polish when I have time, which I don't at the moment. Maybe, a new edition, but nothing really has changed about the process. I haven't like learned anything that I want to incorporate or change substantially.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, it seems like it'd be pretty, timeless in a way.
Yeah, I it's not based on any specific tool or any, it's just
Yeah.
it's a way of thinking more than
Yeah.
anything.
Very nice. Okay, good. And then the future of it, yeah, I mean, I know I had this question on here, like, will it always have a place in corporate learning? I don't think there's a real answer to that. Like, we'll have to see how it goes, but it sounds like it's definitely moving in the right direction. Oh, something I wanted to ask you. You mentioned, I think you said it's like maybe a little scary or a little concerning, like seeing job listings for IDs say you need to be familiar with action mapping. Why is that? Why is that scary to you? Do you worry that they're not? Yeah, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, as you were going, I wonder if they're being rigorous about how they're
Mm.
defining action mapping, because I have seen people teach it, and I've had people come to me and say, I used action mapping for this, and it's an information dump. And
Oh,
so I
that would
know
be
that,
painful. Yeah.
yeah, they may have used what they thought was action mapping, but it did not have necessarily the best result. And so we're fighting what I consider this huge enemy, the the school mindset,
Yep.
this mindset of information presentation, and our tools shove us in that direction, especially if we're talking about e-learning. Like for my toolkits, I didn't use any e-learning tools. I use Twine because it has a lot of, both toolkits have a lot of branching scenarios, but it's a normal scrolling website because the little screen with the next button or the little screen with lots of animations, um, I'm not convinced is always the best solution.
Yeah.
And having those tools to hand, everything starts to look like a nail because we have these hammers.
Yeah. So yeah, that's why I imagined you said that. It's yeah, action mapping obviously has spread rapidly throughout the field, but I mean, I mean, if people are using action mapping and it's leading to an info dump, kind of red flags, and it kind of
Yeah,
yeah, maybe it spreads the wrong message about what action mapping is to like other instructional designers. So all of us who are here, I mean, yeah, it is would be good to kind of be responsible about it. It sounds like, and make sure that if we're saying we're using action mapping to, end to end, that we're actually following the process and focusing on business metrics,
yeah.
practice activities. What do we want people to do? Um, so
And
that
it's
so that it's on all of us, kind of like we were talking about. It's like you put this process out there. It's like how are ideas going to move it forward? Hopefully, it moves in the right direction and gets more performance oriented. But yeah, we need to be very wary of it leading to information dumps and
yeah.
bringing us right back to pre-action mapping. So, so good thing to keep an eye on. I do see we have a little under 20 minutes left, and I know you all have been asking some really good questions. So let's get into the questions from the audience. Does that sound good to you, Kathy?
Sure.
All
I'm just
right.
catching up with the chat. Everybody wants to buy a trailer. I do recommend them over the tiny house, the whole tiny house movement that's very appealing, but man, those are expensive. If you can buy a trailer, you got the same thing. It's small.
Yeah,
It's
people were
small
asking about
footprint, easy to
the
move.
trailer recommendations. I saw like Allison earlier asked that. What trailer should I buy? Yeah. Um, but let's get into the questions in the Q&A tab. And again, upvote the ones you'd like to see answered. That's how we're going to prioritize these.
All
So we
right.
have a question from Moses. How can Kathy's principles be applied into onboarding or new hire curriculum if a lot of it is informational content?
I have a blog post. I think I have a blog post on that. The main answer to that is when the client comes to you and says, we need new hire content, we need something for our new hires, you need to maybe challenge their assumption that every new hire needs this thing dumped on them, and that maybe what they need is a more structured thing spanning over several weeks to help them do their job. And when we take an action mapping approach to this, sure, of course, there's going to be things specific to their role, and there's going to be specific to being a new employee, like choose your dental plan, things like that. Who do you contact with questions about W-2 forms? I haven't been an employee for decades. I don't remember these things. But so there are specific things. So if we're going to action map some of this, we're going to say, okay, there's these specific things they need to do when they're recent. They need to fill out these forms and do this. They're also going to need to do bigger things, like what is the business goal, in fact, of this new hire thing? What is our goal? How is our business going to benefit from us creating this material? And they sort of draw a blank on that. And one thing you could say is we don't want our new hires to quit,
Yep.
because then we have to replace them, and that's an expense. And if you're measuring something, maybe you're measuring how the retention of new hires. Do you have a leak there where people who are hired recently tend to quit, or other things like that? So you find a measure related to the success of new hires, or it could be speed to task. We need them to be able to do whatever it is that they do at a certain percentage of expert speed within a certain amount of time, because our business benefits in this way. With productivity, profit, whatever like that. So you try to find a number with a dollar sign to assign to this project. And when you get them thinking like that, it kind of gets them away from the information dump mode, and they start thinking about, okay, we don't want them to quit, but we'll keep them from quitting. We want this, we want
Yeah.
that. And then you can start building out what is it that they need to do. And as you have these conversations, ideally, the client themselves, this is sort of action mappy angle, you want the client themselves to see for themselves that their original concept was maybe not the best. You want them to say, hey, I think maybe we should do this other thing. You go, yeah, that sounds good. When you're just like, you want to say it, but you
Yeah,
help them see it for themselves, because then they're more committed to it, and you're not, the expert coming in telling them what to do. You are helping them see it for themselves. Plus, they have more expertise in their own organization than you do usually.
very
So
nice.
that would be the principle: is to get them to talk about the business goal, identify the business goal, help them see for themselves. There are many things that a new hire needs to do, some of which might be addressed with training, much of which might be addressed by some sort of like wiki or something for new hires. There's a lot of different solutions. So you walk them through that.
Very nice. Yeah, that resonated with people. Frank got good sales skills. I'm like, yeah, that's like true consulting skills right there. People are saying I use that approach with my husband and kids. So, yeah, but that's good. Yeah, it seems like if you're pushing that on the client, like we need to do this, like they're gonna like pull away. Like, whoa, no, no, no. But it
Yeah.
seems like you go in, you ask good questions, maybe, yeah, refocus the conversation on what the real goals are, and then the client can kind of draw their own conclusions about whether or not their original idea is going to help them get there.
And you want to make sure you save face for them. They're the client.
Yeah,
And so they have to, if they are wrong, ideally they're just going to see it for themselves and quietly fix it.
nice. Okay, good. And yeah, with onboarding a new hire curriculum, again, it's just refocusing the goal there to get back
Yeah,
to
the
the
word
specific
curriculum
question.
right there
Yeah,
is a sign that you've got a client
yeah,
that has to be unbrainwashed.
yep. Nice. Okay, good. Our next upvoted question is from Noah. How can we best apply action mapping principles to more technical context? Technical content, codes, standards, regulations. Matt,
It
you
sounds
could
like
just
maybe are we talking compliance, or are we talking how to use
right.
software? Either way, actually, um, you identify what is it that people need to do. Well, you identify your goal. Again, what is your goal in, for example, everybody needs to know these regulations. We have new regulations. We need training on them. So you say, okay, wait, first, I have a blog post about this too. It's new. They must need training. No, not necessarily. But let's say that these are regulations that change how we're supposed to do our jobs. And some things that we've been doing are now illegal. So we look at what is the business goal for this project to avoid lawsuits, for example. What do people need to do differently? Well, we used to be able to do this, but now we have to do this instead, and this instead of that. And some people are tempted to do this, and we have to help them avoid it. So we're listing again behaviors that we need them to do. We identify what makes it hard to do or not do this thing. And that's a really juicy conversation when we're talking about compliance. And then we go from there into will practice activities help? If it's like a murky thing, like a discussion with somebody who's trying to bribe you, or if it's a cut and dried thing, maybe we don't need training, we just need the information. So we start with what is our business goal? What pain point are we trying to fix? What is it that people need to do to reach this specific goal? Not the pain point is not there are new regulations, everybody must know them. The pain point is because of this change, we could be sued. We want to avoid lawsuits, or we want to improve retention of whatever. But we have to have a measure like that. And that ideally guides the conversation into what people need to do. Same thing with technical content. New software, everybody needs training. Oh, really? Do they? We have to determine, is it significantly different from the old software? And if so, based on their specific job roles, what do they need to do with this software? What are they using the software to achieve? So you base it on what are the job tasks that they're using this software for. So instead of the tour of the menus, you're getting,
Nice.
how do you enter a new product in the new invoicing system? Like that.
Very nice. Okay. And what I'm hearing too, I mean, I think the examples are really helpful, but what I'm hearing is the content or the context, like in a corporate setting at least, isn't so important. Like the approach is kind of the same, whether it's technical content, soft skills content, onboarding content. Because again, the focus isn't on the content; it's on what is the actual business goal we're trying to achieve here. What do we need people to do in these specific job roles to help achieve that? And then further down the line is where some of these other things come into play. Like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe they need to use this software to do this specific thing. Okay, that's something maybe we have practice activities for.
And if you think about your own like use of tools in your own life, or like how to use a chainsaw, if I have to cut down a tree, I'm not going to go into Chainsaw 101. I'm going to go to the guy on YouTube that says, here's a
Yep,
chainsaw, here's a tree. Here, watch me do it.
exactly.
This is
Yes,
how it works. So
such a good
it's the
example.
same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very good. Very yeah, just thinking about how you all learn who are here in the audience, who may be
Yeah.
newer to this approach and not already on board. Yeah, when you wanna learn how to do something new, like that example, yeah, do you go to YouTube? Do you go to Google? Or do you go get, like, the full textbook with everything there is to know on the topic?
The history of
Um,
chainsaws.
the history of chainsaws, yeah. And what I love about this approach so much, and I'm sure it has been clear throughout this session, but just like how practical it is. Like that's what I love so much about it. It's like yeah, we're wasting no time, we're wasting no money, we're wasting no energy. It's like how can we practically help people do something better? I think the people who are on the receiving end of these practice activities, or maybe the people on the receiving end who don't have to sit through training at all now because there are other
Yeah.
solutions that are going to help them do their job better. Like they will thank you for it. Um, 'Cause, yeah, I don't think there are a lot of people who are, like, super grateful for sitting through Infodumps. I don't think that it is an experience. I don't think that's anyone's human experience. I mean, maybe some Infodumps are just, like, so amazing, but,
No.
um, yeah,
No, and to me, that's the sign of a successful project is when no training is done. It's
yeah,
like, okay, we solved the problem.
yeah.
That's it. Nobody has to
Saves
sit through
people
any
some
of it.
time. I mean, yeah, because that's expensive, right? Taking everyone off the job,
Yeah.
sitting through training, all of the hours put into developing it, so, yeah, that definitely does sound like a win. But thank you for the question, Noah. Let's see, we have a question from Susie. And maybe we have time for one or two more. Let's see. And maybe some of these have already been answered, so feel free to let us know, Kathy. But what do we see as the biggest challenge facilitators face within their organization when changing behavioral mindsets from telling info dumps to transforming mapping? So maybe facilitators who want to go from info dump to action mapping.
Mhm.
Guessing with the facilitator, we mean someone who's leading like a live session, maybe.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe this is an organization that relies a lot on live training. And the people providing the training are currently expected to do the PowerPoint thing, a lot of
Yep.
presentation, and maybe some discussion where we break into small groups and we discuss what we've just seen on the PowerPoint. Um, you can tell what I think about that. And um, I think that every organization has a culture. This an organization that relies a lot on that, where the default is live training with a facilitator. That is their culture, and so it's not just saying, "Hey, this way would be better." It's like this is the embedded culture, and there are people who are in they benefit from this. There are people like in instructional design as well. We have people who really like creating e-learning. They really like the animation. They like doing that stuff. And so if they hear me speaking, saying, we should do less of that, that we're creating so many things we don't need, they're going to resist because that's what they like. And so if you're in an organization that likes the fun thing of everybody goes to a different site and we all get to have donuts and coffee and see Bob from the other branch that we never get to see, they're going to resist anything that is not that. And so it's my long way of saying the biggest challenge is cultural. Another challenge is the school mindset, where we all think that, well, everything that we've learned in the past has been a teacher talking at us. What could be any different? And so that would be the biggest challenge. It is a cultural challenge. It's local to the organization, and it's also just a huge cultural challenge in our culture.
Yeah.
And as to how to get around it, my approach has always been to quit. Um, uh, um, if you really like working in that place and that is their culture, then I think leading by example sometimes is a cool thing. And I did do some of that when I was in technical training. Um, I would say, we're going to do what's more like a workshop. and everybody gets a realistic challenge to do on their IBM PC, typing commands in at DOS. Here, you have this issue. Now you have to solve the problem. What are you going to do? What are you going to type in? So you turn the live session into something that's more problem based
Nice.
and more engaging. And then when somebody says, hey, that was really cool, maybe others in the organization move in that direction. And the only way you can design that sort of training is to know what it is people need to do so you can create these practice activities. And that's the action mapping part.
Very nice. Yeah, we could dive deeper into that, but I saw a couple other questions that I think would really help people to see. So maybe we'll try to quickly get to another couple, but good suggestion there. Yeah, within the confines of like a course or a workshop, there are still ways to like make
Yeah,
steps in the right direction. And that was my experience working with clients too. I'm not fully there yet, but it's like I was able to work within the confines and
yeah,
make it a better experience that focuses more on like actions than information and practice.
yeah.
Um, but okay, good. So a couple more questions. Yeah, let's see if we can get to these relatively quickly, but I know you'll have something to say about this. Moses also asked, what about when stakeholders don't track or have metrics? How do you get a good project goal from that or business goal from that?
That is also very often a cultural issue. I refuse to believe that there are organizations that function in the world and survive more than 2 years that don't measure anything.
Yeah.
And this is often this is a problem with nonprofits. In my experience, it's very, very much a nonprofit issue. They say we don't measure anything. You know, we are here to help people, and even a resistance to measuring, where they say that it's like inhumane to measure like how many people quit in a year. It's just so there is a sort of cultural thing that's happening here, but mostly it's fear and the whole structure of corporate world where nobody wants to say clearly, here is a problem, here's how we measure it, let's go about fixing it. Everybody is sort of like, I can't say that, I can't say that. So you, as the designer, talking to your client, they have come to you saying, we need training on widgets. You need to ask specific questions on like, what is the problem that why do you need this training? What are you seeing that shows that this training is necessary? Oh, is that something that you measure? Do you have any measurements about X, Y, or Z? And it's also important to be talking to the right person. There is a person who feels the pain of the problem, and then there's their minion. If you're talking to their minion, my boss, Barbara, told me to get a course on X, then you have to find out how you get to Barbara, because the person that feels the pain of the problem is going to be much more likely to be willing to measure it, define it clearly. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, and I lost
Good
the
insight.
question.
Yeah.
What about when they don't track or have metrics? I say that they are lying if they say they don't have metrics or they don't know. If they may not be lying, they could very clearly really just not know, because a lot of people in business have no clue what the business measures or how a business works. So that's your job to help them. And I think in the book and also in the toolkit, I suggest when they initially contact you with the problem, we need training on making our nurses more kind to the patients. You say, okay, I'll set up a meeting to talk with you about this in 2 days. And then you get on Google and you say, okay, how do you measure this? How do you measure patient satisfaction with nurses? What are other hospitals doing? What is the world measuring out there? You give yourself a crash course in their business so that when you talk to the client, you can say, hey, by any chance, do you measure this one thing? Do you know where you could find that number? Kind of educate them by asking questions.
Yeah. Okay, good. Good suggestions there. I know we only have a minute left. There's so many good questions I see here, like such good questions. The final one, I think this might be a yes, no, and then we'll wrap this up. But thank you for all the good questions. If we ever do another session, then we will have to get to them. But do you have a list of verbs that you use when you're action mapping? That's the last
Verbs?
question we'll get to. From Sarah.
I, I don't understand the question.
Like,
Sorry.
I guess it's like if we're using like Bloom's taxonomy, it's like we
Oh,
have these
okay.
like verbs. So it's like when you're action mapping, do you have like a list of like action verbs or is it Is it
Well, the
is
verbs
it
are based on what they do on the job.
Yeah,
So our example of cutting down a tree, our verbs are going to be um, identify the tree that you're going to cut down, note the direction of the wind, note the direction that the tree is leaning. You can tell I've cut down a few trees. Decide where your felling cut is going to be and what angle it's going to be. Make the felling cut at this angle. Then, actually, the face cut. You make the face cut first, and you cut it this way, and then you cut it this way. And then you make your felling cut, but of course, you've also got the winch. There's this list of things you do. You tie the winch, you do this, you do that. So all the verbs reflect what people do on the job. And if we're talking about a knowledge job, then those verbs represent important decisions that the person is making. It's not define ethics or anything like that. It's respond appropriately when asked X. Okay, so they do need to know the best way to ask somebody for whatever it is you're supposed to ask them, but you don't write it as describe the best way to ask somebody this. You write it as ask somebody this.
right.
So you look out for describe and all of the exam verbs. It's more like the verbs we don't use. We don't use the verbs that show up on an exam. Define, describe. We identify gets the cut only if it really is part of the job.
Right, but so it comes about organically, like, in the conversations with the stakeholders, like, what people need to actually do, so there's not, like, a list we pull from, it's just like yeah, it
Yeah.
comes from the job context itself.
And when you have a
Uh,
stakeholder that says, well, they need to understand this, then you say, what do they do with that understanding? How can I tell looking at Bob that he understands this thing and Martha does not?
yes,
What are they doing differently?
okay.
It's very hard because of the training that we've had, the programming.
Um, well, thank you, Kathy. I mean, we went a couple of minutes over, but
That's
there are
okay.
just so many good questions. Yeah, I wanted to get to them all, but we couldn't. Again, yeah, let's get some applauses. We can react on this
Yeah,
platform. You can use the little smiley face button below the screen. But thank you, Kathy, again. Map it. Highly suggest getting this. We're going to be going through this book week by week. We have a book club info session next week, same place, same time. And we are, of course, starting with Map It to kick things off. So
great.
this is not a replacement for the book, but, if you are interested, please get the book and please join us next week so that we can work through it together. Um, thank you again, Kathy. Always a pleasure to have you here. If anyone also wants to learn more in the meantime, we've done other content with Kathy too. So there's a lot out there on Kathy's blog, on the YouTube channel. Um,
And thank you,
but
everyone, for being such active participants. And thank you for your questions and your comments. And
yes,
go
thank
buy
you.
a trailer.
We're all very big action mapping fans here in the community. So I will
Great.
see you all soon. And thank you again, Kathy. And
Thank
have a
you.
good rest of your week, everybody. Bye bye.